New York. A white supremacist entered Tops grocery store and massacred 10 black Americans in cold blood, wounding 3 others. I want to read into the hearing record names we should not forget of the victims. Roberta A. Drury, Margus D. Morrison, Andre McNeil, Aaron Salter, Geraldine Talley, Celestine Cheney, Hayward Patterson, Catherine Massey, Pearl Young, and Ruth Whitfield. Behind each of those names is a story. A loving grandmother of 6, a sister caring for her sick brother, a father who at the time of the shooting was buying snacks for a movie night with his family. Every one of these victims left behind loved ones who are grieving that loss, and several of those loved ones are in the room with us today. I thank them for being here. There are no words that fill the empty chairs at your dinner table or the empty spaces in your heart. But your willingness to sit in this room, to honor the memory of those you lost, is a lesson in courage and love. Please know that you are not alone. America joins you in grief. We offer our deepest condolences and, most importantly, our commitment to do something. When gunmen are slaughtering babies, grandparents, and other innocent children, Americans in grocery stores, schools, neighborhoods, and houses of worship, we have a responsibility to do something. Nearly 9 in 10 Americans agree we need sensible gun law reform in this country, and we need it now. We often hear the question asked, why do mass shooters engage in such horrific acts? Well, one of their motivations is the focus of this hearing: domestic terrorism, a threat that is, in the words of the FBI Director Christopher Wray, metastasizing across the country. I was just handed a press release as I came into the room that there was a federal indictment handed down today against 5 members of the Proud Boys white supremacist group, including Enrique Tarrio, its former leader, charging them with seditious conspiracy for their roles in the January 6th assault. For those who believe that what the subject matter of this hearing is a contrivance and doesn't reflect reality, these indictments indicate that we are talking about real-life crime and real-life terrorism. Violent extremism, however, just doesn't appear out of thin air. I'd like to turn to a video on the role of the media and the role that they played in dragging hateful rhetoric into mainstream America, and sadly how it's inspiring acts of racist violence.
The country's being stolen from American citizens.
Want to replace you,
Indian voters from the third world.
Their plot to remake America is to bring in the illegals.
It makes our own country poorer and dirtier.
Our civilization is superior to the culture that these immigrants are bringing.
This is a flat-out invasion.
It's a war. Undefended, it collapses.
We're just going to consign tens of thousands, perhaps millions of Americans to their deaths.
We have every right to fight to preserve our nation and our heritage and our culture.
One people, one nation, and immigration. One people, one nation, and immigration.
An 18-year-old white supremacist opened fire on a supermarket. The Great Replacement theory motivated this 18-year-old white supremacist.
Andre was my nephew. He just came here. He was on a birthday party, and he had left behind 5 kids.
She was that light that shone through whatever darkness might have been present.
And enjoyed our life together. I love her.
She loved cooking and sharing food with us.
When all hell broke loose at Tops, Aaron Salter, the policeman, stepped into his assignment.
A woman who survived 3 aneurysms and breast cancer.
Catherine Massey calling for federal action against growing gun violence that ended up taking her life.
Took away my mother and my best friend. This needs to be fixed.
One day I'll be up there with her, one day in heaven.
I first held a hearing on domestic terrorism in the year 2012, 10 years ago, after a white supremacist murdered 7 Sikh worshipers in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. Sadly, 10 years later, this threat has only grown worse. In the decades since Oak Creek, violent white supremacists have killed innocent Americans in a series of sickening attacks. They include mass shootings at the Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina in 2015, Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018, and Walmart in El Paso, Texas in 2019. While each of these attacks was committed by a lone gunman, they're part of a larger pattern. Don't take my word for it. During the prior administration, the FBI and Department of Homeland Security found that, and I quote, white supremacist extremism poses a persistent threat of lethal violence, and that since 2000, white supremacists, quote, were responsible for more homicides than any other domestic extremist group. That was a finding by our government. White supremacists were responsible for more homicides than any other domestic extremist movement. White supremacist violence has swept across America, and this trend raises the obvious question: why is it getting worse? We cannot deny that hate has a big platform. As we all saw in the video, there are media figures like Tucker Carlson dragging racist conspiracy theories into mainstream America. More than 400 episodes of Tucker Carlson's show have amplified the so-called Great Replacement conspiracy theory, guiding principle of the modern white supremacist movement. As lawmakers, we must speak at one voice in repudiating this incendiary rhetoric, along with any individual or extremist group that resorts to violence. And while there are no simple solutions for addressing violent extremism, a promising start is the Domestic Terrorist Prevention Act, which I first introduced in 2017. I'm sorry to say that the Senate was unable to move this forward when I offered it 2 weeks ago. But my hope is that this hearing will mark a shift in our willingness to work together in combating domestic terrorism. That is our obligation as lawmakers, and that is our responsibility to the families like those in this room who've lost a loved one to unspeakable acts of hate. With that, I turn to the ranking member, Grassley, Senator Grassley, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is our third hearing in this Congress on this threat of domestic terrorism. March of last year, Director Wray of the FBI testified before us that the threat of domestic terrorism is really growing. 6 months later, he testified to another committee that the FBI had 2,700 active domestic terrorism investigations compared to the usual 1,000. Some of those 600 cases involved the Capitol riot on January the 6th. Another is a tragic event that the chairman just referred to, the terrible attack by young white racists killing 10 in Buffalo. One of those killed in that domestic act of terrorism was Ruth Whitfield. Her son, Garnell, is with us here today. Nearly 600 events were anti-police riots that erupted in dozens of cities in 2020. FBI Executive Assistant Director Jill Sanborn testified before us in January that 800 domestic terrorism investigations were opened as a result of the 2020 riots. That was 5 months ago. Each time we speak with the FBI, the number has usually risen by a few hundred. However, due to the lack of federal jurisdiction, this is only a small fraction of the 14,000 that were arrested just in the first few weeks. Tens of thousands appear to have participated in mass violence. I was truly surprised by this sheer number of Americans that have been willing to engage in violence in support of anti-police rhetoric. 2,000 police officers were injured, 25 people were killed, and there was $2 billion in property damage with arson as the preferred tactic. For anyone who thinks violence from political left ended in 2020, it didn't. In May of 2022, report by the Center of Strategic and International Studies found that 40% of all domestic terrorist attacks in 2021 were from the left. By anyone who thinks that the violence from the far left didn't begin in 2020, it didn't. In 2016, 2 black racists killed 8 police officers in Dallas and Baton Rouge in 11 days, according to a May 2021 report from the FBI. Black, racially motivated violent extremism was the deadliest ideology in 2017. Even though many in the press only focus on far-right attacks, the most deadly ideology often changes year to year. So, in 2018 and 2019, that was white, racially motivated and violent extremism. But in 2020, anti-government extremism was the most lethal ideology. One constant of domestic terrorism is that the threat is always shifting, and violence comes from all sides of the political spectrum. An Asian man drove a car into a peaceful protest in favor of fair treatment of African Americans. The Waukesha parade murderer and the New York subway shooter had delivered long racist tirades against white Americans before their crimes. I've said it before, and so say it again. We all have to condemn all political violence. We have the time and the resources to combat violence committed under the banner of every deadly ideology. We do not have to choose. We must combat all. At the same time, we have to protect speech. A fanatical Bernard Sanders supporter tried to murder Republicans in a congressional baseball game in 2017. I guess that was in a practice session of that, getting ready for that game. Agreeing with Bernie Sanders politically is protected by the First Amendment. Trying to kill others in support of that belief is not. I don't think any Republicans tried to argue that being a Bernie Sanders supporter made a person a domestic terrorist just because one person who agreed with him was. We have to avoid feckless name-calling because we disagree over major issues. It is unfair, for example, to equate Republican concerns over illegal immigration with racist extremism. And of course, that's profoundly sad. If we're going to come together to solve the problems of domestic terrorism, we have to do so with an eye to solving the problems that truly exist. Reorganizing offices in the Department of Justice that have asked not to be reorganized doesn't do that. Foisting reporting and focusing requirements on them that are intended to push them to combat one deadly ideology more than the others won't help anyone. We have to listen to what is truly needed. Those operating in the terrorism space have asked for a slew of authorities to help them combat international terrorism. I introduced an amendment to the NDAA last year to give them these authorities. It didn't pass at that time. I hope it will this year when I again offer it. Finally, we have to come together to protect our law enforcement officers. The CSIS report that I mentioned already found that law enforcement officers have increasingly become targets of domestic terrorists from all sides of the political spectrum. The report states that government, military, and especially law enforcement were the primary targets of domestic terrorist attacks and plots in 2021, composing 43% of all attacks. Law enforcement officers were the targets in 48% of the violent far left events, 37% of the violence far right events, and all jihadist events in 2021. I understand that from time to time, while our police and our military are often the victims of extremists in violence, they in turn are accused of being the hotbed of extremism. In May of this year, we received an FBI report that stated, quote, available FBI reporting did not reveal RMVE, which is a racist extremist infiltration into law enforcement, end of quote. We've been briefed by the FBI that extremism is no more common in the military than the general population and is not limited to white racism, but includes black racism, Antifa ideology appearing within the ranks. If we're going to be serious about combating extremism, we need to be realistic that the threat is often from outside law enforcement and the military and directed against them, not the other way around. In fact, these baseless accusations of widespread extremism in law enforcement and the military probably only strengthen the likelihood that innocent officers and service members will unfairly become targets for violent attacks. In 2018, members of Antifa in Philadelphia assaulted 2 Marines, believing them to be white supremacists. They weren't, they were Hispanic. It's important that those of us in positions to lead be clear that all violence will never be tolerated. I look forward to working together to do that. I yield.
Let me be clear. I agree with you, Senator Grassley. Violence is unacceptable in this constitutional democracy. Today we welcome 5 witnesses. I will introduce the majority witnesses, then I'll turn to Ranking Member Grassley to introduce the minority witnesses. Mr. Garnell Whitfield Jr. is the former fire commissioner in Buffalo. He tragically lost his mother, Ruth Whitfield, in the Buffalo attack last month. Mr. Whitfield, I know it's not easy for you to be here today in the midst of your loss and grief, but we really appreciate you coming forward so that you can speak for many of the families and friends who had such a terrible time in dealing with this loss. We're also joined by Professor Robert Pape of the University of Chicago. In addition to serving as professor of political science, he's the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. I first learned of your work on one of your television presentations. I'm glad you can be here today to make a presentation. Our final majority witness is Mr. Michael German. Mr. German is a former FBI special agent currently serving as a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, Liberty, and National Security. Ranking Member Grassley, would you like to introduce your witness?
Yes, thank you for that privilege. Justin Herdman is a partner in the Cleveland office law firm Jones Day, served as U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio, 2017 to 21. He was jointly recommended to that position with bipartisan support from our colleagues Brown and Portman. As U.S. Attorney, Mr. Herdman was widely recognized for his success in fighting terrorism and violent crime. He was also Vice Chair of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee. While a career prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office, he prosecuted the case of anarchist bridge bombers. Mr. Herdman also currently serves as Judge Advocate in the U.S. Air Force Reserve. We thank him for his service and for testifying today. Jonathan Turley is Shapiro Professor of Public Interest Law, George Washington University Law School. He is nationally recognized legal scholar who has written extensively in areas ranging from constitutional law to legal theory to tort law. Professor Turley is a specialist in questions of separation of powers and the First Amendment, amongst many other things. He has represented numerous high-profile clients in cases raising these areas of law. We also see his thoughtful commentary on cable TV several times a week. Thank you for testifying today.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. Let me lay out the mechanics of today's hearing. After I swear in the witnesses, each will have 5 minutes to make an opening statement. Then we'll have rounds of questioning. Each senator will have 5 minutes each. And I ask everyone to try to respect the time limits. Now I'm going to ask, as the tradition of the Senate Judiciary Committee, for the witnesses to stand to be sworn. If you'd raise your right hand, do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you very much. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have all answered in the affirmative. Mr. Whitfield, I'm going to ask you to make the initial opening statement, and then we'll go down the table in order.
Thank you, sir. To the members of this honorable body, on behalf of all of the victims who were murdered or injured on May 14th and their families, we sincerely thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. And though I will be sharing with you some of my family's memories about my mother and the devastation her murder has wrought upon our family, the truth is that I'm speaking on behalf of all of the victims and their families. Mrs. Ruth Whitfield was my mother. She was literally and figuratively the heartbeat of our family and my father's soulmate for 68 years. She was the person who held us together, probably just like your mothers did for your families. What I loved most about her was the way she loved her family unconditionally, sacrificing everything for us. She visited my father at the nursing home where he's lived for the past 8 years almost every day, including on the day she was murdered, to ensure that he got the care that he needed from the nursing home and to supplement that care with their own personal and loving touch. Our lives are forever changed, forever damaged by an act of profound hate and evil. And nothing will ever take away the hurt, the pain, or the hole in our hearts. For her to be murdered, taken away from us by someone so full of hate, is impossible to understand and even harder to live with. But we're more than hurt. We're angry. We're mad as hell because this should have never happened. We're good citizens, good people. We believe in God. We trust in God. But this wasn't an act of God. This was an act of a person. And he did not act alone. He was radicalized by white supremacists. His anger and hatred were metastasized like a cancer by people with big microphones in high places screaming that black people were going to take away their jobs and opportunities. Every enforcement agency charged with protecting the homeland has conducted risk and threat analysis and determined that white supremacy is the #1 threat to the homeland. And yet, nothing has been done to mitigate it or eradicate it. We're people of decency. We're taught to love even our enemies. But our enemies don't love us. So what are we supposed to do with all our anger and all of our pain? Do you expect us to continue to just forgive and forget over and over again? And what are you doing? You elected to protect us, to protect our way of life. I ask every one of you to imagine the faces of your mothers as you look at mine and ask yourself, is there nothing that we can do? Is there nothing that you personally are willing to do to stop the cancer of white supremacy and the domestic terrorism it inspires? Because if there is nothing, then, respectfully, senators, you should yield your positions of authority and influence to others that are willing to lead on this issue. The urgency of the moment demands no less. My mother's life mattered. My mother's life mattered. And your actions here today will tell us how much it matters to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. Professor Turley.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the Committee on the Judiciary. It's an honor to appear before you today to discuss the threat of domestic terrorism, a subject that should unite all Americans. You will find no disagreement among the witnesses on that worthy end. And while the means may be subject to qualifications, we share a common purpose in combating domestic terrorism. The powerful voice of Mr. Whitfield just now just reminds us of how urgent this task is. I offer my testimony in that spirit to try to identify areas of one of the pieces of legislation that I believe should be addressed to deal with some constitutional concerns. Extremist and violent speech is obviously not an abstraction for the people who work in this building. House members were shot in 2017. Members of both houses had to be rescued in 2020 due to a disgraceful attack on the Capitol. We all have ample reason to oppose these violent elements on both the left and the right. However, the Constitution does impose some limits on the range of action for Congress. I've tried to address those, ranging from the First Amendment to the separation of powers. I specifically address the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. I note in the testimony that aspects of the Act, in my view, are clearly constitutional. Those include things like the reporting and assessment and training components. The one area that I flag is the prioritization of particular terrorism cases. That raises a novel question. It actually falls into a gray area of separation of powers, so admittedly this can have people of good faith on either side. But for Congress to try to prioritize certain terrorism cases, I think would run afoul of the doctrine of separation of powers. And it's because the law uses a mandatory language in terms of dedicating resources within the executive branch for those ends. There's obviously a powerful interest in Congress in this area. I'm a Madisonian scholar, so I tend to favor legislative authority. I still do in this area. But there's also, admittedly, countervailing legislative encroachment issues that can occur under the separation of powers. Because of the executive branch's authority under the Take Care Clause and the inherent Article 2 powers, I think that those issues would loom large if that legislation was enacted the way it's currently written. I also spent a considerable amount of time in my testimony on free speech. That's where I do a lot of my writing. I've been described as a free speech purist or absolutist. There was a time when that was actually a compliment. I admit to it. I have a very broad view of free speech. As I talk about in my testimony, we have a checkered history of free speech impairments and criminalization. It occurs at times when we are angry, when we're afraid, when we're under attack. Our history is replete with it. It began with John Adams, who not only tried to criminalize opposing views, but tried to execute those who held them. It went through the Civil War, it went through Woodrow Wilson and the Palmer raids, the enactment of the Espionage Act. In each of those periods, not one branch, but all three branches failed the Constitution. All three branches allowed attacks to occur on free speech. It obviously continued with the Red Scare. It continues today as people call for forms of censorship, blacklisting, and criminalization of speech. I believe that this expansion of terrorist investigations raise legitimate questions. that we have to deal with, not to intrude upon those areas. And that is a position that I've held for many years. As many of the members of this committee know, I've opposed broader interpretations of terrorism for 30 years. I've been one of the most vocal critics of Antifa, one of the most violent anti-free speech movements in our history. But I was one of the first to object to characterizing Antifa as a terrorist group for the same reason. We have to be very careful, not because we have different ends or different interests, but in a Madisonian system, it's often as important how you do something as what you do. Fortunately, even though we live in dangerous times, we have a Constitution designed for bad times, not good times. Indeed, the Constitution was written in the worst of times. It's a covenant, not with our government, but with each other. But it is a system that we can't assume is indestructible. It requires people of good faith like yourself to temper what are honest motives to try to combat extremism and protect those things that also define us. I thank you again for the honor of appearing before you, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Professor Turley. Professor Pape.
Thank you for having me. Mr. Whitfield is right. Violent populism is rising in America. Events like the Buffalo shooting that target minority populations and January 6th that threaten our democracy are not simply a continuation of long-standing trends, but reflect the consequences of extremist ideas moving from the fringe to the mainstream. If I could please have the next slide. I'm going to wait one moment to see if we can have the slides. There we go. If I could have the previous slide to that. Thank you. A key extremist idea is the Great Replacement. At bottom, the fear that minorities will have more rights than whites. As these extremist ideas become mainstream, domestic terrorism is evolving in more dangerous ways. On January 6, 2021, we witnessed, to quote Senator Mitch McConnell, a violent insurrection for the purpose of trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of power after a legitimately certified election. The key characteristic of the over 800 individuals charged in connection with the attack on the Capitol is that they are middle-class whites residing in counties with the most loss of white population share, exactly who would most likely fear the Great Replacement as described by prominent political and media leaders. On May 14th, just 3 weeks ago, a mass shooting occurred in Buffalo, New York, where the shooter, a self-described populist, methodically selected his target in order to kill large numbers of a minority group related to his fear of the Great Replacement. These violent ideas are widespread in the U.S. population, and we need to prepare for potential political violence in the future. Let's look at the facts. Next slide, please. The January 6 demographics are striking. Over half of those charged with committing crimes on January 6 were either business owners and CEOs or from white-collar occupations. The last time America saw middle-class whites involved in collective political violence was the expansion of the second KKK in the 1920s. Next slide. Nearly 90% charged were not members of militia and extremist groups like the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys. Next slide. Their political geography is also striking. Over half of those charged with committing crimes on January 6 came from counties that Biden won, including large, urban, Democratic strongholds like Dallas, Houston, New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Next slide, please. The crucial feature of the counties with insurrectionists is the loss of non-Hispanic white population. The more the county lost white population and became diverse, the much higher rate of having an insurrectionist. Why? Increasingly, some politicians and media figures tell whites they are deliberately being replaced by minorities and destined to become second-class citizens. White decline in one's community can reinforce and seemingly confirm these political and media narratives and have impact beyond electoral politics. Next slide. The Buffalo shooter is a prime example. The shooter's manifesto clearly describes his motive as targeting a minority population to prevent what he perceives as, quote, the complete racial and cultural replacement of white Americans. Next slide. Importantly, the shooter lived in Broome County, New York, which had one of the largest declines in non-Hispanic white population share since 2010, nearly 8%. This underscores that white population decline near their home can influence individuals with violent populist sentiments. To understand the risks going forward, we conducted a nationally representative survey with the respected polling firm NORC at the University of Chicago, fielded in April, just weeks ago. Next slide. We asked respondents whether they agree that Joe Biden stole the 2020 election and is an illegitimate president, and whether they agree that the use of force to restore Donald Trump to the presidency is justified. As you can see, tens of millions of Americans agree with these radical sentiments. Next slide. Most disturbing, we found that 7% of American adults, which equates to 18 million people, agree both that Joe Biden is illegitimate and that the use of force is justified to restore Trump to the presidency. This is important. A key indicator of long-term political violence in a country is the pool of the population that sees political violence as justified, and so this figure is extremely concerning. Next slide. The two main beliefs driving the 18 million are, number one, the Great Replacement, 75% agree with that, and second, the QAnon cult idea. Next slide. We did look at economic and other factors, but the Great Replacement and QAnon conspiracies are the far more powerful drivers. Last slide, please. We need to go beyond prosecution after the fact to prevention. Our country needs annual public reports by law enforcement assessing incidents in which people from across the political spectrum, from neo-Nazis to Antifa, turn to violence so that we can better understand the extent and source of the greatest threats. Our country needs a national conversation based on the facts about the consequences of violent ideas moving into the mainstream. Ultimately, the solutions to violent populism are the pillars that have always guided our great American democracy: dialogue and listening to each other. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Pape. Mr. Herdman?
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, and thank you, Ranking Member Grassley, for the invitation to speak before the committee on the vital issue of domestic terrorism. I've spent nearly 20 years of my professional career, mostly as a federal prosecutor, but also in the military, in the field of counterterrorism. While I bring to bear just one perspective on the work before the committee, I believe that my experience as a federal prosecutor in the Northern District of Ohio is of particular relevance on this subject. The Northern District of Ohio comprises the 40 northernmost counties of the state, and it's a true cross-section of modern America. I had the honor of serving this district as a Justice Department official, first as an Assistant United States Attorney from 2006 to 2013, and then as United States Attorney from 2017 to 2021. The title of this hearing, I believe, is fitting. In my career, I have seen the nature of the terrorist threat metastasize. And by that, I mean that the threat has both spread in that incidents are occurring at seemingly greater frequency, and changed in that the nature of that threat includes different actors offering new challenges to law enforcement. The tools brought to bear against terrorism, particularly domestic terrorism, have had to adapt as well. To help illustrate the changing nature of the terrorism threat, I would point to a few cases from my district on which I either worked directly as a prosecutor or supervised as U.S. Attorney. My early work as a federal prosecutor in the office's National Security Unit was primarily devoted to investigating and prosecuting cases involving international terrorism. But by 2010 in Ohio, we had started to observe an uptick and violent extremism with no connection to international terrorism. One example, in 2012, a group of 5 Cleveland area men who were self-proclaimed anarchists considered a variety of violent attacks, including the G8 summit in Chicago and the Republican National Convention in Tampa. Ultimately, they attempted to detonate an explosive device at the bottom of a support column beneath the Route 82 bridge in Brecksville, Ohio, a bridge that spans a deep crossing in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, and their intent was to bring down the entire bridge. In 2013, I was part of the trial team that prosecuted Joshua Stafford, who was the only conspirator from that group who went to trial. In addressing my tenure as U.S. Attorney and the varied threat picture that we faced, I would like to start by addressing the danger posed by white supremacists, either in an organized or individual capacity. That threat is profound, and it is pervasive. In 2019, a white supremacist named James Reardon was arrested by federal authorities for filming himself with a Nazi-era firearm, and over audio of multiple gunshots and screaming people in the background, threatening a mass shooting at the Jewish Community Center of Youngstown, Ohio. And this is a fitting place to pause. as the Jewish community is one with which I worked very closely as U.S. Attorney. White supremacists pose a serious and ongoing threat to our Jewish friends and neighbors, but they are by no means the only such threat. A case that our office prosecuted in late 2018 demonstrates the complex and serious threat picture faced by America's Jewish communities. Damon Joseph was a resident of Toledo, Ohio. He was a recent convert to Islam and a self-avowed adherent to violent jihad. Having been inspired by online videos and materials produced by ISIS, Joseph became increasingly radicalized in the fall of 2018. After the attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Joseph conducted surveillance of 2 Toledo area synagogues and scripted a 9-point plan for inflicting mass casualties at those locations. He was arrested on December 10, 2018, and ultimately pleaded guilty to both federal terrorism and federal hate crimes charges, which, as far as I am aware, was the first time a prosecution for both of these offenses had been pursued. I raised the Joseph case because I think it amply illustrates the grave threat posed to the United States and law enforcement by a host of violent actors. The threat picture that emerged while I was U.S. Attorney was incredibly complicated. While white supremacy and violent jihad offers adherents a somewhat cohesive set of warped principles that ultimately forms an ideology, I saw several cases that defied easy categorization because of blended, evolving, or simply non-existent ideologies. For example, Elizabeth Lacron and Vincent Armstrong were a Toledo area couple who harbored a deep fascination with the Columbine shootings. During the course of the FBI investigation, the couple visited Columbine High School, and over time, this sick obsession with that event moved into active planning for a mass casualty attack at a specific Toledo bar. Elizabeth Lacron separately attempted to acquire an explosive device for use against a gas pipeline. They were arrested in December 2018, and Lacron was ultimately convicted of attempting to provide material support to terrorism in violation of 18 U.S.C. 2339A. 2 more cases, Christian Ferguson and Alan Kenna, were both arrested in 2020 in separate cases. Ferguson was plotting to lie in wait for a law enforcement officer and planned to capture or kill them when they responded to a false 911 call. And Kenna had well-developed plans to attack an Ohio high school with explosives and firearms. I focused on these cases, but there are many more from my tenure as U.S. Attorney that kept me up at night as a federal prosecutor and continue to do so today, even though I'm no longer a Justice Department official. Once again, I appreciate this opportunity to address the committee, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thanks, Mr. Herdman. Mr. German.
Chair Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify about white supremacist violence in the wake of the latest mass casualty attack. I'd like to express the Brennan Center's sympathies for the family members of those killed in Buffalo and all communities targeted by white supremacist violence. I've been working on this problem since 1992, when the FBI assigned me to infiltrate neo-Nazi skinhead cells trafficking in illegal weapons and committing acts of violence. While recent attacks have raised public awareness of white supremacist and far-right militant violence, it isn't new. It's been an enduring threat in the United States since its founding. Yet the law enforcement response remains deficient, despite deadly results. The FBI does not even collect incident data regarding violence committed by domestic violence extremist groups. Professor Pape discussed the Great Replacement theory, which also isn't new. I agree it's too easy to blame social media for spreading racist conspiracy theories, as they are and always have been part of our political discourse, part of our mainstream political discourse. But policing that discourse should not be a law enforcement matter. The vast majority of people who traffic in racist, hateful theories don't present a threat of violence. Law enforcement should instead focus narrowly on those that do, investigate their crimes thoroughly, and target their instrumentalities. It seems intuitive that effective social media monitoring might provide clues that could help law enforcement prevent that attack. After all, the white supremacist attackers in Buffalo, Pittsburgh, and El Paso all gained access to materials online and expressed their hateful and violent intentions on social media. If somebody had reported this activity to law enforcement, it is presumed the police could act to prevent an attack. But threatening rhetoric is commonplace and not just on social media. In the Buffalo case, threats the shooter allegedly made in school were reported to law enforcement, resulting in a psychological evaluation but no follow-up. Perhaps that's because broad-scale social media monitoring and see something, say something programs raise so many false alarms that it drowns out threats, overwhelms law enforcement, and dulls their response. Law enforcement's tendency to downplay the threat of white supremacist violence may have also played a role. Unfortunately, while counterterrorism experts acknowledge that white supremacists and far-right militants are the most persistent and lethal threats in the FBI's domestic terrorism program, law enforcement has a history of prioritizing lesser threats, particularly protest movements led by people of color, civil rights activists, peace activists, and environmentalists. Failing to produce domestic terrorism incident data leaves the Justice Department and the FBI free to set priorities based on their own institutional biases. If law enforcement is to be effective in addressing white supremacist violence, it is essential to better understand how the violent element within the white supremacist movement operates. Congress has done its part to provide the FBI with all the authority it needs. 51 federal crimes of terrorism, 5 federal hate crime statutes, organized crime, and conspiracy statutes. The problem is that the Justice Department and the FBI choose not to prioritize white supremacist violence, and they obscure the data that's necessary to drive reform. If a white supremacist murders somebody, the FBI could consider the crime an act of domestic terrorism, a hate crime, or simply a violent crime. If the FBI categorized it as domestic terrorism, the investigation would be well-resourced and robustly investigated. But it often puts white supremacist violence into lower prioritized programs such as civil rights and violent crimes, where by Justice Department policy, most incidents are deferred to state and local police for investigation. When Senator Durbin introduced the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act in 2017, seeking specific data about white supremacist and far-right militant violence and the FBI's use of its domestic terrorism resources, the FBI instead shuffled its domestic terrorism categories to obscure this data. The Justice Department likewise hides its data about domestic terrorism prosecutions, removing docket numbers from prosecutive data it provides to Congress when it claims domestic terrorism successes. The Brennan Center sued to get these docket numbers, but the Justice Department refused to provide them all, claiming that not all prosecutions that it claims as domestic terrorism statistics are domestic terrorists. The true nature and the scope of white supremacist threat must be understood in order to establish effective reforms. Congress needs better data about this violence and more transparency about how the Justice Department and the FBI use their domestic terrorism resources. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all the witnesses. I'm going to start with the 5-minute round. Professor Pape, great replacement theory is nothing new. Some form of it has been around forever. In the United States, we've seen evidence of it with the activities of the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction and even into the 20th century. I grew up in East St. Louis, Illinois, in the early 1900s with the Great Migration. There was a visceral reaction against African Americans that led to a race riot in that city, as well as my current hometown of Springfield, Illinois, and that led to the creation of the NAACP. So we've seen this many times over. The only question that comes to my mind is, this a different time? Do you find in your research that the social media approach to information in America is exacerbating this situation? Can we add to that the automatic weapons that are now giving to these madmen who are inspired by this racism the means to kill so many innocent people as they did in Buffalo? Is that the difference?
So there's two big differences, sir. First, we have volatile capabilities, those are the weapons you're talking about, now combined with volatile ideas and beliefs in the mainstream. It's not one or the other. You've got the combination of these two, which is why we're seeing many more of these events in the United States than we are, say, in Britain. And this is a very important combination that's a deadly cocktail that promises more violence going forward. The second big change is that we are now seeing those who advocate the Great Replacement receive political benefits and financial benefits. So if we look at politicians in America in the mainstream are either directly or indirectly stressing the Great Replacement and becoming more popular. Donald Trump, the former President of the United States, is more powerful today as a result of January 6th than he would have been without January 6th. That is a very, very worrisome trend, sir. Media figures, you just showed a number of them, they are more popular today as a result of the Great Replacement. So what we are seeing is we are seeing incentives for more politicians, more media figures to follow in those paths. These are the two big changes today, and why we have to be so concerned about the 2022 and especially 2024 election seasons.
Mr. Chairman, let me ask you, we really have a challenge to respect the Constitution and our Bill of Rights and freedom of speech, and yet we see the reality reported to us by law enforcement here in Washington and across the nation that many of these statements are pushing people into extreme behavior, violent behavior. There's no easy way to define a line to be drawn here to respect the Constitution and still keep America safe. What are your thoughts?
I think that the concept of terrorism radicalization that the FBI and Justice Department have embraced isn't established in evidentiary studies. My own experience working undercover, there were people who were ardent neo-Nazis, had memorized parts of Hitler's speeches, were very influenced by the ideology, and others who just liked to make bombs. And this was a group that appreciated their bomb-making skills. So understanding how the violent element operates and how it networks is much more important than understanding the ideology, because there are lots of people who adopt this ideology who are actually against violence. I had people who were ardent Nazis find out who I was hanging out with in the movement and put their arm around me and say, son, you're hanging out with the wrong people. Come work with us. We'll print up a newsletter that we can put out every week. We'll put a suit on you and run you for the school board. We can do things that don't involve violence, because that will get you killed or put in prison, and that won't help the movement. So it's very critically important for law enforcement to understand these differences and understand how the violent element works. And my concern is this radicalization theory pushes law enforcement to want to grab more information from social media or other public forms of communication, rather than focusing on the far, in which millions of people share these bad ideas, instead of focusing on the relatively smaller number of violent acts and understanding how they network. You know, one of the things that the brilliant case agent who worked my first case with me was able to do in Los Angeles was map all the violent criminal acts that were occurring by white supremacists and show how there was some connection between lots of them, and that's what justified the investigation to start doing that investigation. But today, because the FBI puts these in different categories and more often than not defers to state and local investigators who may or may not prosecute those crimes, they don't have knowledge of how the criminal element works. And unfortunately, they don't seem to want it. There have been plenty of opportunities for them to actually collect this data about the violent crimes to understand it better, but they choose not to, and I think that's part of the problem.
It's a point that you made earlier, and one that I'll close with here, and that is the reason for the Domestic Terrorism Act that I introduced was the decision of the Trump administration to no longer have a category of white supremacist crime reported to us. They merged it into a violent crime general category so that there would be no distinction. I believe more information is better, particularly when it doesn't expand the authority of the government or give it any new tools, but really reports on the reality of what's happening across America. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Grassley.
Yes, Mr. Herdman, besides the bridge case, you've been involved with the riots that broke out in 2020. The FBI lacked the familiarity with Antifa movement to see violence or new riots coming, something both Barr and Wolf warned about when they were secretaries. You've also seen threats from white racists, jihadists, and actors with anti-law enforcement ideologies. How do we ensure that the Department of Justice and the FBI are nimble and flexible, just enough to respond to threats of violence caused by different ideologies And how varied is the domestic terrorism threat right now?
Thank you, Senator. Well, the bottom line is, if you're in federal law enforcement, you have to look at the conduct and the threat as it is being contemplated. So you look to the violent act, you look to the planning, and you look to the preparation. And frankly, the ideology matters far less when you're trying to disrupt a terrorism event than the actual conduct of the perpetrators. And it has to be that way. Now, ultimately at trial, that ideology or whatever is motivating that person to commit this act is important because it's motive evidence and it's something that you would want before the jury. But you have to have federal law enforcement postured to be able to identify and respond to actual conduct by individuals, and that requires well-trained agents and prosecutors, that requires close coordination with local law enforcement, that requires close coordination with communities, particularly vulnerable communities, like I mentioned in my testimony, the Jewish community among them, Muslims as well, a whole host of communities of color and ethnicity that are under threat. You have to be postured to be able to respond, and also I would add, Senator, you have to be flexible in the way that you intake complaints. It's very important for federal law enforcement to be responsive to complaints from the public and to ensure that they are able to prioritize and respond to complaints that are brought to their attention.
Professor Turley, is it constitutional and prudential to direct executive branch officers to investigate in combating violence committed pursuant to some extremist ideology more than others?
I think that it is at best problematic. I actually think it does run afoul of separation of powers. I admit that this is that sort of gray area. Separation of powers is not hermetically sealed. There are overlaps between the executive and legislative. But I think this would not fare well in terms of trying to force a priority between individual cases. The Supreme Court has said over and over again, in the cases that I cite, in cases like Quinn, that even though this body itself has investigatory powers, it cannot intrude upon the choice of targets, development of cases, priorities given to particular areas by the executive branch. That's pretty consistent coming out of the Supreme Court and lower court cases. So that's the one flag that I threw on the act, and that I think that the Congress needs to really seriously consider that. As someone who represented one of the houses of Congress, the other house, in litigation, you know, one of the keys is that you don't want to go into litigation unless you have a fairly good idea of how you're going to come out, because you don't want to create precedent against your own institution. I would not view this as a very good course for this body, because I think that courts would look with disfavor on an effort to force the executive branch to prioritize particular types of cases within the category of terrorism.
Mr. Herdman, is it helpful to design executive branch officers around national security threats that exist today, or is it changing so rapidly that there's a benefit to flexibility?
I would always err in favor of flexibility, Senator. There are, in a moment's notice, the entire threat picture faced by federal law enforcement in the United States could change. It could change as a result of an international incident. It could change as a result of some domestic political event. And I think, you know, federal law enforcement has to be able to respond in a way that addresses the threat as it exists today, as opposed to what it was yesterday or what it was in preceding years. We just have to have that kind of flexibility from federal law enforcement.
Mr. Herdman, in your testimony, you noted many instances in which civilian communities, such as local Jewish community in Cleveland, were targets of attack. You formed strong partnerships to help you disrupt those threats. We're seeing that police are now increasingly becoming targeted for extremist violence. I've introduced a bill to gather more information on attacks on police. What else can we do to combat the rising tide of extremism, violence directed against the police?
Yeah, this is a real area of concern. Again, this is one of those things that does not depend on ideology. If somebody is willing to engage in a violent attack, they've almost always contemplated some sort of engagement with law enforcement. And that leads to, unfortunately, proactive planning by perpetrators when they are actually seeking out to kill, capture, kidnap law enforcement. So I would certainly be supportive of any federal effort to look into the incidents of terrorism directed at law enforcement. And I also certainly would be supportive of any federal measure that would seek to criminalize attacks that are made with the intent of killing law enforcement because of their status.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. Senator Leahy.
Thank you, Chair Durbin. I appreciate you holding this hearing because I find it difficult to comprehend we're still in this position. We're having the same conversation we've had for years now about domestic terrorism, the racist ideologies motivating violence that are spreading across this country with little or no check against it. Each day and each week seems to bring new tragic incidents. Increasing number committed by individuals who hold white supremacist ideologies. No one should be afraid of being murdered because they went to their grocery store or went to their place of worship or when they go to work, even here in the United States Capitol. And yet that's the reality facing millions of Americans every day. The heinous mass shooting in Buffalo last month is a painful reminder that domestic terrorism, motivated by white supremacists, is still very present and is spreading in the United States. That's not hyperbole, that's a fact. Look to the FBI. They reported the number of hate crimes in 2020 was the highest recorded in 2 decades. Nearly half of the domestic terrorism investigations that year involved racially motivated violent extremists. 87% of the subjects to those investigations were white supremacists. And now we have another unspeakable tragedy. 10 individuals killed in Buffalo while shopping at their local grocery store, something we all do and which should be the safest place. But they died at the hands of an individual who had been motivated by a racist conspiracy theory. There's going to be accountability for these crimes. But we also have to act against the root causes of this growing hate. And, as the opening of the chair stated, we need not look further than certain political leaders and media pundits who fan the flames of these ideologies. And in doing that, they give them the sheen of legitimacy. We certainly cannot stand by as they're given mainstream validation. We can be heartbroken, but we must be resolute because lives depend on our ability to extinguish the flames of hatred and violence permeating our country. We say we'll pray for the victims. In my state, we pray that the Congress and all of us will come together and pass real laws that will protect us. We have to stand up to misinformation. We have to act together. This should be above politics. And Mr. Whitfield, I was so moved listening to your testimony and what you said about your mother, Ruth Whitfield. My heart goes out to you and everybody who lost people at the Tops Friendly Markets grocery store. I think of your parents, married 68 years. Yes. I think of that as I'll celebrate this summer my 60th anniversary. You said your mother was the heart and rock of your family. I know what that means. What would you like us to know about your mother, Ruth, and how your family's been impacted by that loss?
Thank you, Senator. I'd like you to know that my mother's life mattered. I'd like you to know that there's nothing that we can do to bring her back. I'd like you to know that she didn't deserve to be murdered. I'd like you to know that she was, while she was yet alive, equally frustrated with the banter and the discussions that have gone on for years about white supremacy and inequities within our society. And while she was alive, she spoke vigorously against it. in her death, we're here to carry her legacy forward. And to do what she's no longer able to do. We're here to ask the people here to do their jobs, to live up to the oaths that they took, to serve and protect the people of this country. That's what we're here for. We're not here to ask for favors. We're not here to debate this. This has been going on. You know, this didn't start with my mother's passing. This has been going on my whole life. I was born black, and I was treated differently from the day I was born in this country. And it's time we stood up and recognized that. It's not okay. And we can't keep ignoring it. Thank you, sir.
I thank you, and I pray that we will do the right thing for all Americans. So in my family, for my black grandchildren and my white grandchildren, I pray we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Turley, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. You recently wrote about the cases of two attorneys, Collinford Mattis and Aruj Rahman. Each of these two defendants was facing domestic terrorism charges based on allegations that they had thrown a Molotov cocktail into a police vehicle during the Antifa riots during the summer of 2020. Despite pleading guilty last year to one count of possessing and making an explosive device, which, as I understood it, should have carried with it a 10-year minimum sentence, the Biden administration, if I understand it correctly, has just agreed to a new plea agreement that will result in just a few years of prison time. Professor Turley, are violent attacks on police officers with explosive devices under this circumstance, are they domestic terrorism events, or are they domestic terror threats?
Well, they certainly can be under the definition that you have at 18 U.S.C. 2331. It can fit into that. You know, there are arguments to be made why they decided to downgrade that case from terrorism, and the plea that you referred to didn't receive a huge amount of condemnation because it was still, as you noted, a plea to an offense that was a 10-year offense. It's to keep in mind, one of these individuals was trying to hand out Molotov cocktails for other people to throw them, and the other one, when she was arrested, said that it was unapologetic and said that they only understand violence when we speak through violence. So these were quite strong cases. They were captured on videotape. So it was surprising when the Department of Justice came in and said, we're going to let you withdraw the earlier plea and then plea down. And as a criminal defense attorney, I thought it was really quite astonishing. I've done national security litigation. I haven't seen anything quite like that double step down with to remove the earlier plea. So I think it was very controversial. And I'm saying that, I want to emphasize that I think people of good faith can say that the original designation of the case is terrorism. I can see arguments that this should not fall within that definition. People of good faith can disagree on that. It was the step down from the original plea that was so astonishing for some of us.
Okay. One of the things that I worry about with all of this is that anytime there is an act of domestic terrorism, it should be prosecuted. Domestic terrorism is bad, regardless of what ideology happens to flow from it. And one of the concerns that I've heard expressed about the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, concerns that have been attributed to Department of Justice career attorneys in reviewing the legislation, is they worry that this could artificially constrain the department's resources, directing them toward one particular ideology over another. With domestic terrorism, as in so many other areas of criminal law, there is a high likelihood that what's big one year might change the next year. What's happening a lot in one
season of 1 year might change in the next season of that same year. So my concern would be if we start adopting legislation that directs our activities, devotes more resources to one particular ideology over another, that might leave prosecutors flat-footed when the circumstances change, and that could create other problems. Now, Mr. Herdman, what would be the practical result, in your view, of various executive office reorganizations that would be required within the Department of Justice under the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act?
Well, I think, one concern that I would have is from the perspective of, say, a rabbi in suburban Cleveland, whether the threat to my synagogue is from a white supremacist or it's from a violent jihadist or it's from some other group, that doesn't matter to me as much as the fact that there is a threat that's existent, and federal law enforcement has to be able to respond to the threat to that particular target. So I would worry a little bit about escalating or elevating a particular threat profile because you may unintentionally lose sight of other threats. I think it's better to have a flexible federal law enforcement response, Senator.
And while I've got you on this point, I wanted to ask you about something. That in the aftermath of the extensive violence that occurred in the summer of 2020, particularly in Portland, Oregon, federal prosecutors brought actions. They brought federal charges against 97 defendants. Now, there were other defendants who were charged in connection with those riots, many of them in state court. These 97 were just the federal charges brought in that district. 58 of those 97 have now been dismissed. Now, I know you're a former U.S. attorney. When I was a federal prosecutor, it would have been unusual to dismiss such a large percentage of any category of indictments that had previously been issued. But if 58 of those 97 have now been dismissed, it has me scratching my head. You have any idea why these cases against those particular violent extremists were dismissed in such high numbers?
I really don't know enough about those cases, Senator, to be able to reflect on it. The only thing I would say is, what our guideposts were when we were federal prosecutors was, do the facts fit a violation of a federal statute? And if they do, you pursue prosecution. And I don't know if that's what happened in the case of those dismissals or not. I just don't know enough about it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman, and welcome to the witnesses, particularly Mr. Whitfield. At 86, your mom deserved a hell of a lot better. I want to welcome Mike German in particular back to the committee, because when he got off his undercover work with the FBI, he came to Rhode Island when I was U.S. Attorney and was one of the agents in our FBI field office, and I've had the chance to see the quality of his work firsthand, so it's great to have him here. Couple of questions. Let me start with Dr. Pape. Does history show incidences when violence against a population was preceded by propaganda against that population?
Yes, sir. Northern Ireland is probably our key case we should focus on. In Northern Ireland, there was community support for violence among Catholics in the late 1960s, immediately preceding the rise of the IRA.
So let me jump in and ask if the lesson of history here is also that sometimes the propaganda against that population is deliberate.
Yes, sir. The key part of the deliberate that matters, and this is also critical in the Great Replacement, is the intentionality that's attributed to the actor being evil, malicious. So what you saw on the video that Senator Durbin showed wasn't just simply claims of demographic change. The core part, the anger that creates the violence, is the malicious intent ascribed to those political actors.
And Mr. German, are there indications that propagation of Great Replacement theory is deliberate?
Certainly, and I think it's important to make a distinction between people on the internet saying things that are troubling, people without any position of authority, and authority figures saying those same things. Because when an authority figure says that, somebody who has actual power, it presents a different opportunity to somebody who chooses to be violent, that they're no longer criminal, they are part of a government faction that is encouraging them to commit this violence. So the calculus they have to make is much easier to make, which is why I think that they could amass such a large amount of people that they could actually overwhelm the Capitol Police and assault our democracy. So I think those having authority figures repeat these racist conspiracy theories is what's different now than from when I was working these cases.
So let's go back to before authority figures start repeating these theories, and let's go back to their propagation. I believe Dr. Pape suggested that their history shows that before you get to violence against a population, very often there's a deliberate campaign of propaganda targeting that same population with the purpose often of fomenting that violence. You've said that there are indications that propagation of Great Replacement theory is deliberate. If there are indications that Great Replacement propaganda is deliberate, are there indications not just of what authority figures might be spouting it, but about who is creating it and pushing it out into the internet and into society?
Again, the Great Replacement theory isn't something new, right? The European colonization of the quote-unquote New World was a white supremacist program. The white supremacy was part of our founding and part of our history. So these ideas have always been there. I mean, one of the things
but it seems that they have a lot more currency right now, and it looks like there's been a lot of talk about how much this is spread on Fox News, for instance. Do you think that Fox News is creating this as original content within Fox News? Or do you think there are entities or an enterprise of some kind that is creating the content to be fed to Fox News? Dr. Pape.
So once we have these ideas in the mainstream, sir, the mechanism of their propagation is not a little secret cell somewhere or, let's say, Russian bots. It's the incentive structure of the system. What we are seeing is we're seeing that figures who tout the Great Replacement are being rewarded by becoming more popular after their shows touting the Great Replacement than before. What we're seeing are politicians becoming more popular, receiving more votes by touting these ideas than before. What we're specifically Donald Trump, our former president, highly unlikely to have the political power he has today were it not for January 6th and the ideas underneath that. So what we're seeing, sir, is once these ideas move into the mainstream, the mechanism is no longer a secret cell organization that's, we just got to go root it out. It's unfortunately the incentive structure, and that's why we need a big conversation in the country about this, because otherwise that incentive structure is just going to drive us to more violence.
Well, with my time expired, let me follow up with questions for the record. Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Whitfield, we all express our condolences to you and your family for your loss. Mr. Herdman, I'd like to come to you and kind of pick up where Senator Lee left off. When we talk about the requirements that the Domestic Terrorist Prevention Act puts in place on DOJ, DHS, the FBI, and you're looking at the organizational structure of the agencies involved in this, and your work and experience as a U.S. attorney, your experience leading that group in the advisory committee. Talk to me a little bit when you look at reorganizing the changes that are mandated, how that affects the resources and then the structure at the agency and out in the field, just very quickly, kind of wrap that up.
Well, any reorganization or restructuring is necessarily going to drive substance and what the ultimate outcomes are going to be. So if there are changes that are mandated by FBI headquarters, for example, that trickle down to the individual field offices, where there is a prioritization of one type of crime or one type of motivation over another, you would expect to see, as you would in any large organization, the individual members of that organization.
Okay, so let's go back to that as far as that trickle down goes. And from the comments of Professor Turley and also from you, in looking at this legislation, it appears that it would narrow the focus instead of expand the focus, looking at domestic terrorism. And I think that we want to make certain that all forms of domestic terrorism, that there are eyes on all of those threats. And someone had mentioned earlier the need for flexibility in the agency. So pick up from there.
Yes, Senator, that was me, I think, actually, who talked about flexibility. And again, I would just point to what we should expect from federal law enforcement is an analysis of facts. And I would, again, emphasize this point. I don't think ideology is as important when you're focusing on facts. You want to see what the conduct of the individual is, how imminent the potential harm is, what they're planning to do, and most importantly, what they're planning to attack so that you can help defend and protect it. And that is devoid of any sort of analysis of the ideology, because you have to focus on what the person is capable of. As I pointed to in my written testimony, plenty of cases where people had no discernible ideology, but they put our friends and neighbors in Northern Ohio at risk, and we had to respond to that.
Okay. Professor Turley, I want to come to you. You talked a little bit earlier about free speech and political free speech, and I know you have always been an advocate for protected political speech. So I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about how law enforcement can differentiate between political free speech and extremist threats as they track and investigate and monitor terrorism.
Thank you, Senator. I think that the key distinction here was drawn by Mr. German, but also Mr. Herdman, that it's not ideology, but actions. It's what people are doing that the FBI has to discern. We have a really wicked brew of hate in this country. The only common denominator are people who are consumed by hate. And the FBI has to go and try to isolate what are the threats that are greatest against the country. And the concern from the free speech community, and I'm not alone in that, the ACLU has also raised questions about this prioritization, but also the expansion, more the expansion, I should say, for the ACLU of domestic terrorism investigations. The concern is if you tie a particular ideology as a criteria or element for an expansion of domestic terrorism. Section 2331 is fairly general. When you read it as a civil libertarian, sort of alarms go off because you're like, wow, you could put a lot of stuff covered by this provision. But for that, one can understand that you have to write more generally. But it also means that the application of that language is really important. So if you combine a focus on an ideology, it really raises concerns among the civil liberties community. Because keep in mind, the Palmer raids, some of our worst periods of time, had that trigger. You know, that we were arresting communists, anarchists, socialists, because their views were viewed as inimical or dangerous to the country.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank all of our witnesses and Mr. Whitfield, our deepest condolences to you on the loss of your mother, who sounded like an incredible person. We've been talking a lot about the ideology that drives the kinds of mass shootings in our country, but in listening to some of the responses to questions. I think that a large factor and a large part of the kind of mass shootings that occur in our country has to do a lot with, regardless of ideology, with the easy access to guns that we have in our country. I'd like to ask each of you, do you agree that the easy access to guns is a significant driver of and a factor in mass shootings in our country? We'll start with you, Mr. Whitfield, and go right down the line.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, absolutely. Gun access is certainly a driver of this violence. It's certainly a large part of the problem. But I would say that it comes under the banner of white supremacy. It's just one of those things that are contributing to it. And there's a lot of other things, that would come under that banner.
We can even set aside the ideology, although I agree with you that the rise of white supremacy in our country is a huge part of it. Mr. Turley.
Thank you, Senator. There's no question. I mean, we have a country awash with guns. We have hundreds of millions of weapons in the country. The task that I'm working with a lot of members with right now in terms of finding a way to do that constitutionally, there are limits, and we're waiting for a major decision from the Supreme Court that may give us some insight into what the range of movement can be under the Second Amendment.
Well, we know that the Supreme Court has acknowledged that there are certain limits that we can place on Second Amendment rights. Professor Pape, do you agree that our easy accessibility to guns?
Without a doubt. Since 2015, we have 5 mass shootings around the world related to the Great Replacement, killing many people. 4 are in the United States. That is almost surely due to the easy access of weapons that can kill 10 and more in a very rapid period of time compared to the rest of the world.
Mr. Herdman?
Senator, every case that I described for the committee involved at least the contemplation of acquiring firearms or the actual attempted or acquisition of firearms. So they do, like they do with any other type of violent crime on the federal level, when we're dealing with federal firearm statutes or federal terrorism offenses, we're almost always looking at a gun at the center of that violation.
So you'd agree that easy access to guns in our country is a problem?
I'm not, the characterization of easy access is one that
It's relative, but it's pretty easy in our country compared to a lot of other countries.
I only pause because there is one case that I'm thinking of where the individual did not purchase a firearm because they had a prior felony conviction. It was one of the cases I discussed here today.
Mr. German?
Yes, I believe the easy access to firearms is a contributor to mass shootings, and I would point you to writing my colleagues, the president of the Brennan Center, Michael Waldman, and Brennan Center Fellow Eric Rubin have produced on this issue.
So based on the relative unanimity of acknowledging that easy access to guns in our country really contributes to these kinds of horrific shootings, that we should do something about to provide limiting who can get guns and limiting access to guns. Professor Pape, you mentioned that you noted in your testimony that violent populism is rising in our country. Do you think that this trend is going to change anytime soon? And if not, why not? If so, why?
If we don't do anything, if nothing changes, I'm worried that, yes, it's going to continue into the future. A point about guns, ma'am, if I may. We are now in the worst of both worlds. We are pushing gun legislation that will almost surely not pass. That's just my view as a political scientist. But what it's doing, and this is according to our data on our nationally representative surveys, is that it is making those individuals who would have the violent sentiments even more concerned and more dangerous. So we need to be aware that it is not a free move to simply call for legislation on guns that goes nowhere, because there are many people in those 18 million that I point out who are already concerned the federal government is coming for their rights. So if we push legislation which goes nowhere, what we're doing is inflaming the problem more than we're solving it. Very important to see. That's inside of our data. If we go forward and look at the next several years, The system, as I was just explaining to the other senator, we have a system now where once these dangerous ideas are in the mainstream, there are incentives for mainstream media figures and mainstream politicians to propagate them even more. And those incentives are not exactly they want violence as much as there are benefits. And we've seen this in other countries, in India, Northern Ireland, where politicians and media figures push dangerous ideas to gain votes or to gain media popularity, and they accept or they don't notice or they don't understand that it's also creating violence as a byproduct. That's what's dangerous about the next few years. As we go forward, we have created a system now where these ideas are in the mainstream. They're no longer in the fringe, and there are incentives for both political leaders and media figures to continue to propagate those dangerous ideas.
I agree with you, Professor, that this is a complicated situation. On the other hand, if we, I realize there are a lot of attitudinal cultural things that are going on in our country that leads to the kind of violence we see. On the other hand, if we do not enact some kind of legislation, for example, Hawaii has some of the strictest gun safety laws, and note that Hawaii has the lowest incidence of gun violence of any other state. There is a cause and effect going on here. So if we propose legislation, I agree with you that if we don't enact gun safety legislation, that just, I would say, tends to exacerbate the situation. But what if we actually passed some of these laws? I think it would be a big help, don't you?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Rono. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, and thank you for holding this important hearing. To Mr. Whitfield, thank you for sharing your memories of your mother. Thank you for helping all of us understand the kind of life that she led, the way that she offered personal, loving, caring support for each and every member of your family, the way that she traveled to care for your father and to make sure that he was in good hands, the way that he inspired your lifetime dedication to public service. And in addition to offering my condolences, I just wanted to thank you and your siblings for what you're doing to put your pain and your loss to a positive purpose, to come here and to call on all of us in Congress to take concrete steps to combat terrorism inspired by the ideology of white supremacy. Nothing that I can say or that we can say here will lessen your loss, but I hope you know that we hear you and we are taking your message and the witness that you and your family have offered our nation to heart.
Thank you, sir.
Let me ask two questions, if I might, of other witnesses before I run out of time. Professor Pape, so much of our political rhetoric today is just cranked up to the extreme on the ends of our political spectrum, and some then lose perspective on the profound impact that the words of elected officials and politicians have. As you've cited, there's examples all over the world in history where marginal figures become politically popular and rewarded for their feeding an ideology of hate. For decades, hideous concepts like this great replacement theory were relegated to the margins of political discourse. But those days seem to be over, and you've talked through how many of the January 6th insurrectionists who stormed our Capitol, beat and killed police officers, threatened to hang our vice president, were motivated by this great replacement theory. Your research shows a connection between the individuals who choose violence and insurrection, and specifically those individuals who stormed our Capitol on January 6th, and the counties in the country where the white population is declining compared to a more diverse population. Do you believe the mainstreaming of political rhetoric that echoes this great replacement theory contributes to the spread of violent populism? And what do you think we have an obligation to do, those of us who are elected, in terms of calling out and denouncing this great replacement theory?
Sir, I think a very important historical analogy is Slobodan Milosevic in the 1970s. He's the famous Serbian leader who, in the 1970s and 80s, was a minor figure until, in the late 80s, he touted essentially the great replacement idea in Serbia, which is, he said, Muslims are gaining so much demographically, they will replace Serbs, white Serbs. That led him to become more famous to become the president of Serbia, and then just a few years later, that very concept led to one of the most disastrous civil wars in Europe's history in Bosnia, which was
disastrous civil war and ultimately a genocide.
And ultimately a genocide. It was hard to see the roots of that in, say, 1986, 1987, even in 1989, when he gave the famous speech that many of you will recall. But this is the danger of those ideas, because they take on a life of their own, and that's really what's important. Yes, sir, I do think that we have an obligation as a country, and it's our political leaders, it's our community leaders, it's our university leaders, it's not just one side, and it's not simply a law enforcement problem, because by the time the perpetrator has acted, too many are already dead, as we are seeing around this room. We can't wait and just act after the fact. The key here is to have a national conversation. Are we willing to tolerate these dangerous ideas in our mainstream when we know they are already associated with what's happened in Bible study group 2015? The cases I think I'm seeing the families already know. We've already got that evidence in front of us, sir. We need the conversation to, are we going to accept this as a country or not?
And so, if I might, Mr. Adjournment, just to follow up, this is a country that will never outlaw dangerous ideas, but has to take action against dangerous actions. And finding that balance, if I might, Mr. Chairman, I think is important. You've spoken to how the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act would provide critically needed assistance to state and local law enforcement to actually properly identify, investigate, prosecute actions, violent actions, that might be inspired by these dangerous theories that need to be denounced by mainstream political figures. Help me understand both why that's an important component of the law being proposed by the chairman, and how you think Congress and law enforcement can strike a balance that preserves treasured civil liberties while protecting against a rising tide of white supremacist domestic violent extremism.
I think what's important is getting the data. There was discussion earlier about giving the Justice Department and the FBI flexibility to address what kind of violence is occurring. The problem is, with that flexibility, there has been an active deprioritization of the most violent threat. So today, the FBI can't tell you how many people white supremacists killed last year, or the year before that, or the year before that, because they don't collect that kind of incident data. And if you look at, if the FBI characterizes these crimes as violent crimes or hate crimes instead of domestic terrorism, that's deferred to state and local investigation. So they don't even know what happens there. They don't collect that data. But in the federal system, the Justice Department prosecutes white supremacists mostly through the Violent Crimes Program. And I say mostly, but significantly through the Violent Crimes Program. So you have cases where dozens at a time violent white supremacists are arrested, but that doesn't go into the terrorism statistics. So the problem is really the data, and to the extent the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act requested that data, I think that is what's critical to understand where those should be prioritized, because it's absolutely correct. There are other ideologies that people claim justify their acts of violence, but we have to know which area to mass our resources. And if we're not massing our resources to the most violent threats, we're not satisfying the obligation the Justice Department and the FBI have to protect them all.
Thank you. What I hear you saying is that this horrific, violent act, this shooting that took so many lives, innocent Americans just enjoying their freedoms, going about shopping at a grocery store, doing nothing wrong. If we don't do more as mainstream political leaders from both parties at all levels to stand up and speak out against this great replacement theory, and if we don't do more to empower law enforcement to track, to report, to investigate, and to take action against those who become violent who are motivated by this theory, then we're failing this moment in our nation. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Coons. I would like to add, because there's been quite a bit said about the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which failed to move forward on the floor of the Senate a couple of weeks ago, a bill I introduced several years ago. That bill requires reports to Congress on all underline domestic terrorism activity with a breakdown by specific category. The categories include, members may not have seen this FBI circular, but the categories include racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, anti-government, anti-authority violent extremism, animal rights, environment violent extremism, abortion-related violent extremism, all other forms. What we did in the bill that I brought to the floor was require that white supremacist terrorism be restored as one of those categories. It was eliminated under President Trump. So this notion that we're keeping it all generic is not true. The FBI already delineates, and what we were doing is reestablishing a category. Senator Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Whitfield, it shatters me that you have to be here, and the pain that you and your family are enduring is unimaginable. I want to thank you for turning your pain into purpose. Coming down here has got to be very difficult, and the fact that you're testifying before Congress on these issues just shows me what kind of mother you had.
Yes, sir.
I was also kind of moved. I walked in late to the hearing coming from a classified briefing, and I heard you talk about very candidly what it was like growing up as a black man in America,
Yes, sir.
and how you realized very young that you're perceived as more dangerous often, that's often used as a justification for people taking police action. We know that blacks are more likely to be killed by the police. We know that implicit racial bias, you have study after study that shows a black person, a white person in this country accused of the same nonviolent drug crime, the black person will get longer sentences. We know that even black women in this country are more likely to die in childbirth, even when you control for race and education, because their pain is not perceived to be taken as seriously. And the kind of subtle dehumanization that often comes. And what's moving to me about you is that you understand that this is not about black versus white.
Right.
This is us. We're all in this together. And that we are a nation that needs each other far more than we realize. And I think on that fateful day in Buffalo, we realized the danger of allowing hatred in any form in our country to fester. Because that hate is not just visited upon one, its effects and impacts are felt directly by families and communities, but it tears at the overall fabric of our democracy. Yes. Mr. Pape, I think your testimony was really moving to me, and because this is about the hope of our democracy. It really is. I have never imagined that I would be this worried about the future of our country. And the mainstreaming of these ideas begins to undermine the necessary cohesion for a democracy to function. This is the great question in America's history, and every generation seemed to answer it the right way. Will we get better at being a multicultural democracy? Will we not let the hate of the Irish, the hate of Catholics, the hate of Southern Europeans, the hate of Asian Americans, will we not allow that to undermine the highest ideals of humanity that this country represents? And so I feel like we're on a perilous precipice. I think that so much of this, when I turned on my TV and saw that the January 6th riots, so many of them had anti-Semitic symbols and racist symbols. And so I know from your data that you had that this is not militia, and those are all concerns. And I think my colleague for bringing up the issues of the ease of access to guns is what causes the violence, and we should not ignore that reality. But I'm more concerned about the culture of contempt we have in our country.
Yes.
And you said something, and I want you, and this, no, I don't want to create false equivalencies, but I know me as a politician probably would have raised a lot of money if during a State of the Union address, I yelled out an expletive at the President of the United States, Donald Trump, if I had said something like, "You lie." I know this because it happened to President Obama, and that person had their best fundraising quarters after he did something by bringing in that kind of outrage into our sacred civic space in a congressional hall for a presidential speech. And so I guess the two things I want to get in my 10 seconds left is, one is driving this point home that this is not about us versus them. This is about the continuation of our country, of our democracy, that we are inching closer as this hatred, this contempt, culture of contempt spreads. And then I'd like for you to close by just telling me, you keep talking about the limitations and your skepticism about us doing certain things, but what should we ultimately be doing as this body to try to bring this nightmare that we're all experiencing in real time to an end?
The crucial thing, Senator, is to compare this to the 1920s, when we also had great replacement ideas. Then it was Catholic versus Protestant, and that led to the second KKK. The difference, sir, is the greater polarization of the country now. We are having political logjams today in ways we did not in the 1920s. And that is what's creating, it's almost impossible now for our political leaders to come to agreement on these major threats to our democracy. What we need to do is we need to break through those logjams. And I can tell you the importance of it.
How? What's your antidote? What's your advice?
The obvious thing to do is to build from the center and to build working groups of the 10 of the senators who can really work together the most, and to build out from there, and then to build a national conversation from that group, regardless of what happens in the outcome of the 2022 election or so forth. The difficulty is that the electoral pressures are so intense that it's getting in the way of any serious governing, sir. And this is what's different between today and the 1920s. In the 1920s, we also had these types of threats. We did not have the degree of political polarization that we have today. And we've got to find ways, even as we're polarized, to focus on the center going forward.
So I'll just say in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, there is a toxin, and I actually agree with your prescription, and I think it's going to take thousands of acts of humble grace to begin to cure what is all of these pressures. However, I don't know when the very algorithms that are built into our social media, my friend Van Jones and Newt Gingrich, when they wanted to do a segment on Crossfire, the last one called Ceasefire, the producers stopped them because the ceasefire was making ratings go down. We have all of these larger corporate entities that want to germinate outrage and hate because it sells better. It creates their stronger platforms. It creates greater audience participation. This is the trap that we're in that is germinating hate, and it has infected this body as a whole. So the only correction I would have to you is I do think the onus is on the acts of grace of this body, but I honestly think if it's just this sector and it's not media and business and culture and churches, if it doesn't go all the way down into our neighborhoods, we're lost. And so that's the only hope. We are not only not our enemies, but we are each other's greatest hope and greatest promise for getting out of a trap. And if not, God bless America, but we are in peril.
Thank you, Senator Booker. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of the witnesses here today. You know, there ought to be at least 3 propositions on which all of us can agree. Number 1, violent crime is always unacceptable and should be punished severely. Number 2, hate is wrong. And number 3, the machinery of the federal government should not be used as a tool to target and persecute your political opponents. All 3 of those propositions should be ideas that bring us together regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. Unfortunately, we see over and over again efforts to politicize acts of violence. when it comes to white supremacy, when it comes to vicious hate groups like the Klan or the Nazi Party. In my view, they are unequivocally hateful, bigoted, racist morons who should be denounced and despised. I do think my colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle try very hard to erase the history of the Klan, that it was formed by elected Democrats, that its leadership was almost entirely elected Democrats, that the authors of the Jim Crow laws were without exception elected Democrats. And I also think today's congressional Democrats try to use the charge of white supremacy, which is undoubtedly evil, bigoted, and wrong, and weaponized by their own party. They try to use that as a proxy for attacking a political party they disagree with. And they do so by diminishing anti-Jewish violence, anti-Asian violence, violence directed at white people, violence directed at police. My view is simple. Violence is always wrong. Whatever your ideology, left wing, right wing, no wings. If you are seeking to hurt people, it is wrong. Is violence from white supremacist extremist organizations a problem? Absolutely. As is violence from other hate groups. The Brooklyn subway shooter was a known black supremacist who called for racial violence. The Waukesha attacker who murdered 6 people driving an SUV into a Christmas parade was a viciously left-wing black nationalist bigot. 2016, another black nationalist gunned down 5 police officers in Dallas. I was there with President Obama at the funeral for those police officers. He did so on explicitly racial grounds. In 2019, 2 anti-Semitic domestic terrorists gunned down 4 people in a kosher grocery store. San Francisco in the past year has seen a 567% increase in anti-Asian violence. Anti-Jewish hate crimes in New York City are up 148% in the first quarter of 2022 compared to the first quarter of 2021. And then, of course, we have the violence of the Antifa riots and the Black Lives Matter riots that racked this country. As stores were looted, police cars were firebombed, people were assaulted, people were murdered. My colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle sought to excuse, sought to apologize for, even went so far as raised money to bail out of jail the violent rioters committing these acts of violence. When it comes to violence, the Department of Justice should not treat it as an excuse simply to target the political opponents of whatever administration is in power, Republican or Democrat, but instead, violent crime should be prosecuted vigorously across the board to keep people safe. Mr. Herdman, you personally prosecuted the anarchist bridge bombers, 5 left-wing extremists who broke off of the Occupy protests and plotted to bomb a bridge in the Cleveland area. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator.
Can you describe that case and what you encountered there?
Well, it was an evolving threat picture. There were a number of different attacks that were contemplated as I spoke to in my written testimony. There were discussions about going to Chicago and engaging in attacks on NATO or G8 summit that was held that year. They also discussed attacks in Tampa with the Republican National Convention being held there that year, and ultimately settled on a bridge in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, and attempted to bring it down with a group of them gathering one night on May 1st, 2012, in order to try to bring that bridge down.
In your judgment, do policies that result in giving a slap on the wrist to violent criminals and violent terrorists, that release people who commit riots and acts of violence, release them with minimal to no jail time, do those policies protect society? Do they keep us safe from violence?
One of the advantages of being a federal prosecutor was we typically got people held on bail, and we typically had very strong penalties for when they were convicted of a federal crime. And if we were going to hold somebody accountable under federal law for a violation of federal criminal law, those were my expectations as a federal prosecutor, that they'd be held on bail and that they would get a severe sentence as a result of a violent crime.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Durbin went to vote. And so I just want to start out by noting that the intelligence community has identified racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists as a category of people most likely to conduct mass casualty attacks. I think we have an agreement on that. But one thing that wasn't noticed, and this is just 1 year of statistics, but was not noted by Senator Cruz, and that is that the FBI reported that of the racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists it was investigating in 2020, so let me be very clear about the category, 87% were white supremacists. So I just think it's very important that the record reflect that. It's certainly not all of them, but it, at least for the recent year that we have data on, it was the majority of them. So getting to that, Commissioner Whitfield, I am so sorry for your loss. I understand that your mom was a loving and devoted mom and wife, and that she was at the market buying groceries for your dad, who is in a nursing home. And I can't imagine what you, your father, the rest of your families are going to, and I just want to respect your courage for coming forward and speaking today, and want you to know that there's a lot of us that are on your side here and want to take action. While there's nothing we can do to bring back your mom or the other victims at the grocery store, how can our response to this tragedy help you, your family, and your community to heal?
Thank you, Senator. First of all, by calling it what it is, and not, sweeping it under the rug and beating around the bush. It is white supremacy. It's a problem. And this young man, though he pulled the trigger, others loaded the gun. Others fed him. Others radicalized him. All of the things that we've been talking about here today contributed to his racist, evil behavior. And until we start holding those entities accountable and calling them out, we're not going to be able to do anything about this. There's a lot of talk about whether you deal with the ideology or you deal with the acts. The truth of the matter is, if you just deal with the acts, you're never going to stop it. You're going to be after the fact all the time. How do you stop it? You have to deal with the ideology. You have to start at the root if you're going to ferret this thing out. So you're asking what you can do. I don't have the answers, but we have to call it what it is. We have to start by identifying what the issues are and address them and have, real conversations about that. We have to face these things.
I think that's
as
a really
a
good
country.
point. Thank you for that. Mr. German, white supremacist violence is just pointed out. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Whitfield. White supremacist violence is a nationwide problem. In Minnesota, white supremacists bombed the Islamic Center in Bloomington, Minnesota. Law enforcement, Justice Department, including the FBI, worked for years to solve the case, working through the years and not giving up. And they found those responsible and brought them to justice. And it turned out that the perpetrators were part of a larger domestic terrorist militia, which specifically targeted the Muslim community because they wanted to drive Muslims out of the U.S. Can you talk about why it is important for law enforcement officials to identify crimes as domestic terrorism, getting to the point that he just made, when they occur, because of the signal that sends, but also the importance of categorizing and keeping track of the crimes in that way?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I think it's critically important to understand the criminal acts and focus for law enforcement on the acts. It's for the rest of us, and certainly people in positions of authority, to denounce hateful ideas and conspiracy theories for the lack of accuracy there. But for law enforcement, they need to focus on the actual criminal activity to make sure that they are not infringing on First Amendment rights of people who are just expressing their ideas. But there is plenty of that activity out there that law enforcement today puts into different buckets that deprioritize or don't even have the FBI and Justice Department looking at. And that's the critical part, is we need to call things like and make sure that this information isn't being lost, because it provides intelligence that can be used to help prevent the next step.
Thank you. Welcome back to the committee, Mr. Herdman. The FBI-led Joint Terrorism Task Forces, which operate along with U.S. Attorney's Office across the country, are on the front lines on this effort to address domestic terror. During the Rules Committee hearings that I chaired that investigated the January 6th attack on the Capitol, we found that a key issue in the run-up to the attack, as you know, was a failure to share information between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. We know that wasn't the cause, but in fact, we learned that we had to do a much better job in how we responded. Based on your experience as a former U.S. attorney, what are the ways that federal law enforcement can best work alongside state and local partners when it comes to domestic terrorism?
Thank you, Senator. Well, presence on the JTTF is absolutely essential. You have to have local and state law enforcement present in your JTTF if you're running an FBI field office. Sharing of information, either through a state fusion center or through other bulletins that can go out to local law enforcement, again, very critical to make sure that that information gets out. And I think also, you know, a much unheralded part of this is regular communication with political leadership, particularly municipal leaders. I think that's a very critical element of the JTTF's work in coordinating with local authorities, is to ensure that mayors, council people, everyone else who's responsible for public safety functions in a given city or area are aware of what the potential threats are.
Mm-hmm. Another question of you, Mr. Herdman. In testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee in April of 2021, FBI Director Wray noted that, quote, social media has become in many ways the key amplifier to domestic violence extremism, end quote, because disinformation can spread quickly among like-minded people because of the algorithms, because they've set it up, because the way they've done all this, in which they have profited greatly at the expense of so many people. Do you believe that social media has made it more difficult to counter disinformation that can radicalize people and inspire them to violence?
Yes, I think that's undoubtedly true. That there are, I mean, social media has probably not made a lot of things better in America, but it certainly has not played a positive role when it comes to spreading disinformation and potentially radicalizing people who would do harm to others.
And I think it's one of the reasons that many of us on this committee on a bipartisan basis and throughout the Senate are focused on this, whether it is allowing researchers to look at the algorithms, a bill that Senator Coons is leading, and many, many others are looking at that amplification issue, because the amplification actually means profits for them. And it means that hate speech and violent speech and that kind of thing is spreading, which has led, of course, in part to many, many deaths. So anyone else want to answer that question? Yes, you, Professor.
Well, I think it's important to know, Senator, that in our research, our nationally representative surveys that find between 18 and 21 million have insurrectionist sentiments to this day in our country, that it's not mainly a social media problem. I understand social media is very potent, and I'm one of the terrorism researchers who pushed that with ISIS 4, 5, 7 years ago. So I'm a very a big believer that that can matter in certain circumstances. It's important to know today, however, that for the 18 million with 18 insurrectionists in our country as of just April, 40% report Fox News and Newsmax as their major news source. Only 18% Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and just 10% far-right social media like InfoWars, Gab, and Telegram. I'm not telling you that pound for pound, the viewer of Fox can be as stimulated as the viewer of InfoWars. What I'm telling you is there's so many more viewers in the mainstream. The problem here is the mainstream. And it's a very difficult problem to get around, but it is something that we need to confront. And if we just simply keep thinking this is just another social media problem.
Well, I don't think anyone, I may be the first one bringing this up, and I just want to say I don't think anyone is saying that. What I'm saying is we know that these killers have basically posted online, they've posted warnings, many of them online, and then they've actually posted videos of them committing the crimes, because that's their reality. That virtual reality is their reality. And for us to just turn our backs to that and not think that it has something to do with this, I just think is wrong. That's where they're seeing the ads, by the way, for the guns that are with Santa Clauses and Star Trek figures and Star Wars figures. That's where they're seeing them. So I just, as horrible as all of this is, and that Mr. Whitfield has to listen to here, at its core, this is about white supremacy, what happened in Buffalo. We all think there's some widespread agreement on that. That is about guns, but it's also about how the information is being transmitted and our inability in this chamber to do one thing about it, because we've done zilch, zippo, nothing. So I just want to make that clear as we go ahead, that this is also part of the solution. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. I had to go to vote on the floor. I thank you for covering while I was gone. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to thank you for creating the forum in this committee to scrutinize the racist rhetoric and online spaces that are fueling the rise of domestic terrorism in America, in addition to the mainstream outlets that Professor Pape has repeatedly reminded us of. And if, as we're doing this, I think it's not just appropriate, but necessary to consider easy access to guns in America as jointly enabling these violent extremists. In Buffalo, the perpetrator's weapon of choice, after the radicalization, the weapon of choice was an AR-15 that enabled him to turn his hatred into carnage. And just this past weekend, Mr. Chair, as you know just as well as I do, there were at least 10 more mass shootings, violent incidents that meet the definition of mass shootings. 10. At least 15 people died as a result. At least 60 were injured. And that's not to mention the countless others, friends and family members of the victims, and others who are now terrorized for fear that it could have been them or it might be them next time in those very communities and across the country. I've said it before, we've said it before, and we'll say it again. This has got to stop. This violence, this carnage is unacceptable. Our children deserve better. Now, turning to my questions, over the years we have seen a growing reliance on the internet, life on the internet, and most notably, but not exclusively, but most notably social media to spread racist conspiracy theories and to radicalize and recruit domestic terrorists. First question is for Mr. Adjournment. In your written testimony, you share your belief that racist conspiracy theories are often hiding in plain sight, and that reporting the spread of these theories and relevant threats of violence to law enforcement could help prevent future attacks. However, you also note that the sad reality is that the FBI receives thousands of tips concerning violence on social media each and every day. In light of this reality, what are your thoughts on how local, state, and federal law enforcement officials can play a more strategic role in identifying credible threats of violence against Americans?
Thank you for that question. I think part of the problem is that the FBI and Congress reduced the criminal predicates necessary to start investigations. So by removing the need for evidence-based triage, right, that we're actually saying there is evidence to suggest that a crime may occur, was the standard that I worked under. Reasonable indication that criminal activity may be occurring. Removal of those through the changes to the Attorney General guidelines and in legislation like the Patriot Act opened up the floodgates so that see something, say something became the policy. And the FBI had a policy of responding to every single allegation that came in over the transom. And what this does is just like pulling a fire alarm when there isn't a fire is illegal because we know it dulls the response. This tends to dull the response. The agents responding tend to believe this is going to be a false alarm just like all the others. I'm going to do the least I can do to close this one and move to the next one because I have more piling up in my inbox while I'm out cleaning this up. And I think that is the problem. And restoring those criminal predicates would help the FBI and state and local law enforcement triage these incidents better so they could focus where there was actual evidence of criminal activity.
Thank you. I was going to acknowledge that the New York Attorney General has announced that her office is launching an investigation into the social media companies whose platforms were used in planning and live streaming the shooting in Buffalo. I was going to ask what additional suggestions you have for disrupting the pathways to radicalization. You've talked about modifying the criteria to begin an investigation. Is anything else before I move on to my next topic?
I think one thing to keep in mind is that social media is a double-edged sword for violent people on the internet, right? Yes, it helps them spread their message, but it also leaves a permanent record that is evidence that can be used against them. And oftentimes what we see is these platforms are very leaky, and that data is out, and that data was helpful to civil litigants who brought a civil case against the Unite the Right rally organizers because they had access to that material. Likewise, the FBI had access to that material, but you didn't see them making the same efforts to prove conspiracy cases in the Unite the Right case, except in one exception. So I think that's the problem, is that they need to use what evidence there is and follow up when there is actually a violent crime. Most of the people who committed violence at the Unite the Right rally weren't ever prosecuted for it. So that's part of the problem. In Portland, was mentioned before, Proud Boys and other far-right militants were coming across state lines to commit violence in Portland for years. And the lack of law enforcement attention is what enabled them to have such strong networks that they could mobilize to, according to the government's allegations, organize the attack on the Capitol. So it takes actually looking at the evidence of that criminal activity, but too often that gets ignored.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chair, I know my time is up. I'd like to ask just another question, one more issue, if I may. Because you've heard me talk about this time and again since I joined the Senate last year, that America is a nation of immigrants. That's our story since the birth of this nation. And I believe that the diversity of our country as a result is a source of incredible strength. Now, in America, we believe that we're all created equal and should enjoy equal rights. So it's deeply disturbing to me to see right-wing media figures, to your point, Professor Pape, as well as politicians, including the former president, prompting racism, hatred, and division in the United States of America. Sometimes subtly, sometimes not subtle at all. So it's important that we shine a light onto these frightening ideologies that fuel domestic terrorism so we can stop the spread of violent hate. Professor Pape, in your written testimony, you state that some, and I'll quote, some politicians and media figures tell whites that they are deliberately being replaced by minorities and destined to become second-class citizens, and that minorities will have more rights than whites. And just the reference to second-class citizenship sort of implies that there's a first-class citizenship. So I want to focus for a minute on the word replaced, actually, because use of that word replaced is very purposeful.
Yes.
And very powerful. So in your studies, just expand on how you found individuals who believe in and promote the great replacement theory, how they may believe they're more deserving of citizenship or that first-class citizenship than those of another race.
Yes, so Senator Durbin showed in the beginning of the hearing some very prominent examples of exactly what I'm referring to, Senator. What I'd like to do, though, is tell you about the focus groups that we have conducted that I haven't told the committee about yet, and I think you might find this even more interesting, because I'm sure you're going to be able to find the clips in the media. The focus group, so we have not just been surveying the population, we have been focus grouping people in that 18 million of, and what we have discovered is many of them are able to repeat almost word for word the kind of dialogue that Senator Durbin showed in the beginning. And it's about how the Democratic Party is deliberately replacing whites with non-whites, and it's through immigration, through other policies. And it's also about how they feel that they have a target on their back as being whites, and they feel like they are becoming second-class citizens in their own country. So it's not simply the media language that I'm reporting to you, sir, in those couple of sentences. What you don't see is underneath that the 80 focus groups that we have conducted, which is providing evidence after evidence of the power of that media. And I would just suggest that as a follow-on hearing, it would make a lot of sense to focus directly on the role of the Great Replacement in mainstream media and to bring on the actual people and with academic researchers, and we can have a real discussion of why is it those folks in the media don't think they're increasing violence. Let's have a real national conversation.
And lastly, just out of curiosity, can you give a couple of examples of what rights are we talking about? What rights do whites think that they're going to be losing potentially,
yes,
or that?
Absolutely, sir. So let me just, I can't, because of confidentiality, I can't tell you their exact names, but let me just give you somebody who's 69 years old, a male in Connecticut who owns $1.5 million home, beautiful, complaining about how he is the son of an immigrant. He comes from immigrants, but what's happening now as a result of the Great Replacement is that his political rights are being taken away point by point by point. This is the belief in the steal. The steal, that the idea that the election was stolen, there are people who really believe that election was stolen. What that equates to in their mind is their political rights are being taken away. Then they move to their economic rights, where they'll discuss affirmative action policies and so forth, that they see as mainly harming their children, sir. So it's not so much a 69-year-old man well off living in Connecticut is worried about getting a future job, but he will explain how his children and grandchildren are having their economic rights taken away. Those are the positions being pushed in these narratives that I'm explaining. So these are rights which many of the immigrants, people came to this country to achieve political equality or economic equality.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Padilla. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I couldn't help but notice the reference to Connecticut.
Yes, sir.
You and I have talked, and I have great respect for the theories that you've advanced and the analogy or comparison that you draw to the 1920s. But tell me if I'm wrong. In the 1920s, assault weapons or firearms like assault weapons were pretty rare if they were used at all. Maybe
non-existent.
The organized crime forces doctored or mechanized rifles to be automatic or semi-automatic. They were machine guns. But the flood, Professor Turley has remarked that we're awash, to use his word, in firearms. Well, we're awash in assault weapons. And so I think that the connection to firearms here between violent extremism and domestic terrorism and white supremacy, the replacement theory, that combine of toxic and poisonous forces with firearms is unmistakable. And it should be an area for action that certainly doesn't violate the First Amendment. I condemn violence. I support law enforcement. I believe we need to support police in their efforts against violence. But you go down the list of white supremacist extremist attacks. 2012, Oak Creek, Wisconsin. 2015, Charleston, South Carolina. 2018, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. 2019, El Paso, Texas. 2022, Buffalo, New York. Racist, white supremacists, violent extremists, these threads are linked to firearms. And often it is the lone offenders, as they're called by our intelligence community. They're regarded as a major source of violence because of, and I'm quoting one of those intelligence reports from the ODNI, quote, access to firearms. So I don't know whether members of the panel want to comment, but it seems to me that the constitutional argument against banning assault weapons, or at least raising the age, the constitutional argument against red flag statutes, which separate people from our firearms if they say they're going to kill themselves or others, seems to me that constitutional argument is pretty specious, and that we are in a different era from the 1920s.
Senator, I won't speak on the constitutional issues, but the Buffalo shooter, when you read the manifesto in detail, you will see that he didn't just select the AR-15 in a general sense. He built his whole attack plan around the AR-15. And a few details that I think are important to bring out, if I may, are that he deliberately selected the shopping center that he was going to go to because the reviews online showed certain aisles were slow, and he was going to target with his AR-15 the aisles that were slow to maximize the number of people he could kill before he would either be captured or killed. So he built the attack plan, not just in a vague sense, sir, but in detail around the AR-15. And it's so disturbing when you see that this took certainly thought. He put methodical thought into not just getting an AR-15, but how could he maximize the use of that AR-15.
Senator, if I could follow up.
Yes.
On the constitutional side, I certainly agree with you on the age limit. That's an issue that I think there is room at the elbows for us to discuss. On the ban, I have to tell you, I'm skeptical. The courts are going to press this body on why they're banning the AR-15, but not higher caliber weapons or the similar caliber weapons. The AR-15 is the most popular weapon in the United States. 1 out of 5 purchases People like it because it's modular. You can change it, and that appeals to a lot of people. You have at least 15 million of these things. So you have both constitutional and practical barriers that you have to address. But on the constitutional side, people talk about the earlier ban. The president said that. That was before Heller. That was before the court said that the Second Amendment is an individual right. I think that you're going to have a much more difficult time going into court with a ban on the AR-15 unless this body is ready to answer those questions in comparison to other non-banned weapons.
But you would agree on the age limit?
I think the age limit, that's something that we've been talking about for a couple weeks now, and I think there is room there. As was stated, Heller said that this is not an absolute right. There are absolute rights. Even the First Amendment's not an absolute right. We did see an age limit that was struck down in California on the AR-15. That is still in litigation. We don't know how the court's going to come out on that. One of the reasons a lot of us are looking at that New York case, it may be dicta, is whether we're going to see what the range of movement is.
Yeah, my time has expired, and I litigated an assault weapon ban in the state of Connecticut when I was Attorney General. In fact, I tried the case and then argued it in the state Supreme Court, and we won, but that's a state Supreme Court decision, not a United States Supreme Court decision. And I recognize that the court is about to rule in a case, even though it's not directly on point. They'll say all kinds of things that may impact the decision. So I think, you know, the point is indisputable that a country awash in assault weapons is going to be a lot more vulnerable to any hate or violent extremism. And I am one of the leading advocates of the No Hate bill, which we passed. But I think that gun violence prevention is key to conquering violent extremism as well. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Thanks to the panel of witnesses, particularly Mr. Whitfield, for being here today with your friends and family. I appreciate so much your attendance. It really is sad that we have to come together for this reason, but you're standing up for your mother, and your amazing description of her life is an important thing for America to share, and you have given us that. The other victims and their families represented here today, our hearts go out to you, and we accept your challenge. We were elected to do a job, now do it. There's no excuse, and I hope that we can summon the political will and courage to get that done. To the other panelists, thank you so much for each of your contributions. I will say briefly that one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle noted the fact that it was Democrats who wrote the Jim Crow law. It was Democrats who may have organized the earliest days of the Ku Klux Klan. I'm not arguing that point. He's right. But it was also a Republican, Abraham Lincoln, who enacted the constitutional amendments that guaranteed the right to vote and said that there would be no discrimination based on race. And yet, sadly, that party, that Republican Party, when given a chance to renew that commitment recently, did not stand by President Lincoln. So history has a lot of explanations, and none of us can escape it. I thank you all for being here. Extremism is still a sad and reality in America. We have to do everything we can to make this country safer. Buffalo, New York was an illustration of why that's necessary. With that, the Senate Judiciary Committee will stand adjourned.
Quite an honor.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was great to see you.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. nice to meet you.
My honor. Thank you.
Yeah, Mike. Oh my gosh, that was super, Mike. Yeah, absolutely great. Sure, sure. I'm pretty now in the Zoom world. It's pretty easy now, and you know, so I'm glad to do that.
You know, it's always interesting how
Right.
Great. Aaron, thank you so much for everything. Thanks. Great to see you. Have a great trip back.
I hope we find a chance to be in
I hope so
together
too.
again. Okay,
Yeah.
good luck. Good luck with
It was
everything.
a great pleasure to listen to both of you.
Oh, thanks.
Great to see
Yeah,
you
great
again.
to
Great to see you, sir.
Hi, Stephanie. Oh, absolutely.
So we actually will do.
Absolutely. Well, I hope you can take up that idea of having a panel on the media and the Great Replacement. I mean, and I don't know why you just don't. I mean, Tucker won't come.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Why not? I mean, I just don't. I mean, and, well, let me also tell you something you don't know. So we've done what we do in social science is we show people videos and we get reactions. We've done that with Tucker's video to veterans, to veterans, to veterans, and this would be a very powerful thing.
1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2.
For their skin color. It is very hard to teach my little 9-year-old girl that there's hate in some people, but not everyone, that most people are good. But there are bad people, and I don't know why we're arguing about it. I don't know why we're arguing about ways to stop those bad people. We are not here attacking anyone. There is no hate in our hearts. We never walked into a grocery store hating anyone and bringing an AR-15 to kill them because we just couldn't stand the sight of them. That's not us. And yet I'm asking you guys, who I know it's not you either, the people that are elected and the ones who are electing them, it's not in us. And I refuse to believe everyone's narrative that this is some battle between blacks and whites or between anyone. Because it's not, we're not fighting. We're not fighting anyone. We are asking for help. We are asking for support. This is not just a black thing. Our nation is so mixed up and so diverse. I promise you, if you're just as dark as a brown paper bag, he would have still shot you, regardless if you were black or not. That is how ignorant that person, that thug is. We are asking for support. That's it. Say, yes, this was wrong, and go and tell your legislators and the people you voted for, you know what? This is wrong. And what is a simple bill that we can pass to say the hate crime against blacks is the same hate against everyone else? It's the hate against Jews. It's the hate against the Taiwanese church that was attacked in California. It's the hate against LGBTQ+. It is hate. And unfortunately, some humans have hate in them, but it's not all of us. So the ones who don't, can you just support us? Can you just give us your love because we're really in need of it?
Oh, Anita Eberhardt.
I'm Zanetta Everhart. I am the mother of Zaire Goodman. He was an employee of the top shooting. So Zaire was injured in the shooting. He was doing his job that day. He was helping, I believe, Miss Whitfield with a cart in front of the store when he was shot by the shooter. Zaire was shot through the right side of his neck, and the bullet came out of the back. But the bullet didn't actually come out. It shattered inside of him. So Zaire is left with shrapnel inside of him, probably for the rest of his life. His wounds are healing, but the shrapnel is starting to protrude into his back, and I can feel it when I clean it. And so, yes, we are pleading with Senate, with our elected leaders. We are pleading with you to raise the age on buying guns. We are pleading with you to fix the education system in this country, because if we're not teaching true African American history in this country, we are doing a disservice to everybody. I just want people to know that the east side of Buffalo is my home. It is where I was born, where I was raised, where I still live, and where I do the majority of my professional work at. It is love there, no matter what people say. And that is Zaire's neighborhood, and that's Zaire's community. He walks to the Tops on Jefferson. We live blocks from the Tops on Jefferson. He rides his bike to the Tops on Jefferson. That is our neighborhood. That is our community. Yes, we are Black. We're not going anywhere. We're gonna stay Black, right?
Amen.
Like, that's just what it is. Racism has always been a part of this country, but we're not going anywhere. So we're gonna have to figure out how to live together.
Before we have our last speaker, Garnell Whitfield, his brother Raymond is here, and he was in the audience today. I want to give him an opportunity to say a word. Raymond.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Raymond Whitfield. I'm the younger brother of Garnell and the youngest son of Ruth E. Whitfield. You've heard much about my mother, very eloquently stated by my brother, so I won't go into much about that, except to say, as much as my heart breaks for my mother, my confidant, my everything, I want to say that after joining these families, my heart breaks for them just as much as it does for my mother, because we looked at each other and we said, you know what, after we told our stories about our mothers and our husbands and sons, our families, we just said, you know, these people were the salt of the earth.
Yes.
They were easy, soft targets. Many of them couldn't even run if they tried. He went to that grocery store and he shot them down like animals. And I just think it's a poor strategy if you're trying to eliminate us as Black people in America to pick the most caring, loving, and forgiving of us and shoot them down on a grocery store floor. That's all I want to say. I'll turn it over to the rest of you guys.
Garnell Whitfield was our witness here at the hearing and did a remarkable job bringing to our minds the image of his mother and what she meant to him. Garnell?
Just want to say it's truly a blessing to be here with the other families. We've gone through the last few weeks in our own silos in some cases, and have not spent a lot of time together. But it's been a blessing to be here with them to share our stories, our grief, and our support for one another. We're very thankful for that opportunity. Very thankful for the opportunity to be here today. I mean, you've heard the stories about my mom. You've heard all of us talking about our loved ones, and we thank the Senate for allowing us to be here. We sincerely do. But we're not naive enough to think that they can do this alone. This is a clarion call for all of us as human beings, as Americans, to stand up and speak truth to power. To put our own comfortability at risk for something greater, to risk, our security for each other. That's what we're supposed to do, and that's what we're asking America to do. You guys behind the cameras, you guys have a lot of power. You guys have a lot of influence. You're here covering us, but there's a lot of other people who don't support what we're trying to do here. We need to hold them accountable. Amen. You can help us with that. We expect that you would do that as good Americans. So we're not here asking for handouts.